Romantasy books are some of the best-selling fantasy books in the last 10 years. It's a subgenre that has really exploded, and as someone who is constantly surrounded by fantasy books and consuming fantasy books, it's kind of a sin the fact that I haven't read one yet. So, being around the Valentining time, I thought this is the perfect time to jump into my first ever Romantasy book, as someone who's only really read classic epic high fantasy. And I'm really excited to check out something that's so majorly popular that I haven't even dipped my toes in yet. So with close to no research, the two big names I can think of when I think about Romantasy is Rebecca Yarros with Fourth Wing and Sarah J. Maas, who has a couple series. She has A Throne of Glass, then she has ACOTAR, Court of Thorns and Roses, and she has an even newer one, something about House of something and something. However, I'm pretty sure Rebecca Yarros with Fourth Wing, that's a pretty new thing, and I think it was her first book into Romantasy, whereas Sarah J. Maas is kind of like a flagstone name for Romantasy. So I think if I'm going to do it, then I have to read Sarah J. Maas first. And what seems to be her biggest series is A Court of Thorns and Roses. So here we go. What is the dad's problem? I do not understand why he is so completely useless. I really need to kill this guy and hunt him down and escape and... Look at the pretty tree! Okay, I just want to say the bog, that's super cool and also way more dark than I thought this book would go. And I love how the light goes through the tree branches and hits the grass and wow, look at... Am I reading the right book? It's dark. It's got some dark stuff in it. A pretty manor. Look at all the gardens and the wow, weird sex magic. Hell yeah, Nesta. I'm glad someone gets how useless the dad is. Not a huge fan of throat bobbing imagery. So I have finished A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. Now, I have thoughts. I have lots of thoughts. The first thing I noticed was I wasn't a huge fan of the writing style. I do think it can be very modernized and simple, which is usually fine for me because I read a lot of Brando Sando, who's known for his very simple, accessible prose. But I think it's just the style just wasn't necessarily my thing. So I did also swap over to the audiobook, and it was the dramatized audiobook, and I enjoyed that a lot more than reading it physically. So I did jump between the two. Also, it was super cool to see some of the tropes and the setups that a lot of people talk about with Romantasy, and I assume this is one of the first that really set up some of these tropes, because I do feel like it was very what I expected in a lot of ways. There was a lot of things I didn't expect, which I will come to, but I do think just kind of the setup and the character archetypes and things were pretty lined up with what I expected going into the book. This idea of a young girl who kind of has this, what seemingly is a useless family, get whisked away and thrown into this fae realm of magic with this super hot fae guy who's going to look after her. Is kind of a setup that I've heard about just from being online and in the communities. However, I didn't mind that because this was kind of my first delving into that type of story, so I wasn't too bothered that the start was very what I expected. What I didn't expect was how dark some of the elements of this story went to. I loved that part. The fact that I don't know if it's just because I went in with some sort of preconceived notion that it was going to be kind of just more adventure fantasy, but there were some pretty dark scenes in this book. Not necessarily at the start, but kind of in the middle and then later in the story. There were some moments I was like, oh, that's awesome. It's really cool. It is just not what I expected. I mean, for those who have read it, the wing scene, absolutely brutal. And also, it wasn't even just the brutality of that scene, but it was Lucian's response to that, and the fact that then he clearly has gone through worse. is pretty dark and messed up. And there was more than one. It wasn't just one or two scenes, especially at the ending sequence with Claire. For those that read it, I was surprised at the level of dark places this book went. And that element I really, really liked. It was cool. It was strange because some parts of the book felt rather young, especially with Feyre being very immature. I do feel like sometimes her character kind of flip-flopped, and it just didn't feel natural for her as a person. There were some moments, especially early on, when she was like, oh, there's magic. Clearly, magic was used on me. Oh, well, and then just continued on with what was going on in the situation. I feel like someone who has lived in the human world and hasn't dealt with any magic would have more of a reaction to that situation. And also, her being able to just switch off all thoughts is bizarre. Early on in the book, when she's being led through the forest and she sees this beautiful manor, in her head, she's thinking, I need to escape and kill this fae, and I need to do this, and she's doing all this scheming and plotting. Then all of a sudden it's, oh, look at how the light hits the leaves. Look at how beautiful the manor is. Look at how beautiful the sunlight hits through these trees and these canopies. And I'm like, what? You were just talking about life or death situations, and now we're talking about the pretty light? And continuing on with Feyre, there were some moments where I was like, the thing she's doing feels very for the plot and very convenient. There was a situation where she starts going to Lucian, for those who have read it, and clearly she wants to talk to one of these two fae, and one is clearly more angry than the other. One is just letting her roam free and do what she wants, but the other one was ready to kill her and be very, very angry. And who does she go to? The very angry one that wants to kill her. Doesn't make any sense from a logic standpoint. She should have gone to the other one, Tamlin, and it boggled my mind, and I can't decide if it's just Feyre's an idiot. And there were a couple of other moments like that kind of didn't quite work in my mind. That being said, I think Feyre also had some really, really good moments. I really liked her development to do with the Fae and kind of her bias towards them. She, at the start of the book, very much hates all Fae, and the fact that she's ripped away and pulled into the Fae world and starts to see that it is more nuanced and there's bad and good kinds. And there was one conversation between her and a Fae, and the Fae talks about how he's okay with some humans, he knows some are bad, some are good, but overall he would help a human, doesn't want to keep slaves. And she did not think the same about Faye, and it really painted her in a bad light, and her coming to the realization of her bias and this sort of, I suppose, racism, seen as Faye are a different race, was a really interesting character arc. I do wish that we delved more into her character across this book. I felt like a lot of the time she was just whisked through the narrative and wasn't particularly active in a lot of the scenes, except the end. The end, I think, really brought her into a more active situation in some ways. There was some weird stuff there, but I won't go into details for spoiler reasons. One of the reasons why I jumped over to the audiobook early on was the start felt very, very repetitive with its prose. It really nailed home some of these fundamentals with the world building over and over, and I was like, I know this. There's a huge wall between them. It's not overly complicated. I don't need to be reminded of it 3 or 4 times in a couple chapters. And I do think that that's something that improved greatly as the book went on. To start with, it did feel very ham-fisted with some of the setup with the world building. However, later on, the delivery on some of the information was a lot more organic. We had Feyre kind of looking at this painting, and she sees these 7 courts and how they are all in different seasons. So we have a night court, which I know isn't a season, but there's a night court, a spring court, autumn court, summer court, and some other ones as well. And that was really cool. I really liked the world building once we got a wee bit more information about the Fey realm. That was really cool. And some of the antagonist stuff, which again, not getting into because of spoilers, but I was fair impressed with the world building. It does a really good job of setting up the series, because now I'm like, okay, I want to visit some of these other places because we've talked about them so much. And it sounds really interesting to kind of see the difference between the different locales. And the other thing that was really impressed with the world building was the creatures. We only met a handful, but they were proper awful, really interesting monsters that were just really cool. Which again goes back to my other point about it being darker than I thought. Some of these creatures were pretty horrific. And I loved that. That was awesome. That element of the story was really cool. And sort of the creature designs and characteristics were just something a wee bit different, and I enjoyed that a lot. With some of the plot twists and the turns later on in the narrative, as more comes to the forefront and you learn more about the Fey realm, it almost has a fairy tale-esque feel to it, which was really cool, especially if you're into that sort of thing, and the fact that it is Fey, so the fact that we have this fairy tale undertone to the narrative, which I didn't really get at the start, but the further we went on and we learned more about the situation that the Fey realm is in, that was really cool. It was an interesting kind of flip on not what I expected would happen. There was a major turning point at the end, right at the end, that I do wish was foreshadowed a little bit more. Now, it was foreshadowed, and we did get okay, we're coming to realization because it has been foreshadowed, but it just still felt very convenient. It was like 2 passing mentions in the book, and it such a huge part of that final climactic moment that I really would have liked the book to kind of hint at it a wee bit more throughout, so it didn't feel too left field, which it did feel very sudden and abrupt, and for the plot convenience. Overall, I do think this book gets better as it goes on, and I did enjoy the end sequence. There's one element that was a bit weird, but again, I'll get into the weird sex stuff in a minute. But the ending sequence, other than that, with a lot of the characters and the side characters getting built up and really interesting, I enjoyed that a lot more than the earlier moments in the narrative. It does definitely improve as you go through. Now, of course, in case you didn't notice, I have not talked about the romance yet. So let's talk about the romance. This is a romantasy book. So, of course, a key part of the narrative is around this romance. Now, I thought most of it was pretty well done. Perhaps the first 60% felt very natural. We did cover a long period of time in those first 60-70% of the book, which really helped kind of see the development in the relationship between the 2 main characters and kind of see this natural growth. I do wish that we got more smaller scenes, more little hints that that's kind of where it was going. We did get some, and I think it was done pretty well, but I just wanted a little bit more to really flesh out that change. And when it does very much change, this is my only issue, it changes very abruptly. There's hints that it's going that way, and there is mini spicy encounters, shall we call them. However, when we have a particularly spicy scene, I do think that Farah just immediately goes from, yeah, I don't know that much about him, but I like him, to, oh my god, he's my world and he's everything. And I felt like that was too quick. The build up to the first part, I was all for. I saw the slow organic growing, fine. But the immediate jump as soon as they had a scene together, it felt like she jumped from, okay, this is, I like him, to he is everything and I would burn the world down. And that part just felt far too quick for me. If we had that and then another year or something, I would be like, okay, fine. A year of being together, whatever. But it felt like it was a couple days, and then, or maybe even a day. And suddenly she was obsessed with him and was willing to risk absolutely everything. And it was just too quick for me, especially when you get into that last section, that last act. The amount of sacrifice and turmoil she puts herself through for this guy felt a little overkill in my eyes. And it made for a really good, interesting plot. I really enjoyed it. But it didn't feel natural for it to be that quick. I will say I was really impressed with some of these side characters. At the start, they were very stereotypical, very archetypal, especially with like her dad. I still do not understand her dad's character. He was like a shell of a man in the first part, and I still don't understand his motivations for being that much of a shell. He was a bit of a strange character, but the two sisters were really interesting, especially Nesta, and learning more about her. Really, really liked her as a character, as well as some of the other Fae that we meet later on in the book, how they are really fleshed out, not just the main couple that we know pretty early on, but some of the other ones. Learning more about them was so interesting, and they were really interesting characters, which I really enjoyed. Before we wrap this up, well, what's with some of the language? I've heard people talk about some of these terms being used, but reading them in the book confused me. I don't like some of the terminology used. Not a fan. Why do people purr? I know it's I'm going to assume it's more metaphorical than them actually purring. And yeah, your bowels turning to water. I don't know what that means. I'm really confused. I've heard that talked about out with, and I assume this is kind of where it's come from, but it's a term that's used more than once, and I don't know how to imagine that imagery in my head, and even when I come up with something, I don't like it. Some others I wasn't a fan of. Their throats bobbed. No. And tongues war danced. For the most part, those types of scenes were fine, but just some of the terminology. Overall, I am glad I read it. I am glad I've tried some Romantasy. I'm not sure it's necessarily my thing. I do feel like the main focus wasn't necessarily on the elements I really liked. That being said, if you have read more of the series and you think, oh, Andrew, you should read more of the series, let me know. I'd be really interested. Should I continue reading this, or should I try something completely different and read something like Fourth Wing to see like another side of the subgenre? Let me know in the comments below if you've read this and what you thought, and if I should continue or read something else, or is just Romantasy probably not my thing. But thank you very much for watching. That's really not helpful. Meg, no. Jeez. Meg.